Hi guys, welcome back to another episode of our podcast, Nothing in My Brain. I'm Joey.
And I'm Olivia. And in today's episode, we're honored to invite Dr. Suzanna So, who is a licensed psychologist and also assistant professor at California State University, Long Beach. Okay, so just to start off the episode, could you introduce yourself briefly and talk about your journey in becoming a licensed psychologist for our viewers?
Yeah, so my name is Dr. Suzanna So, and I am, as you said, a licensed psychologist here in California. But originally, I'm actually from Chicago. And so I did I was born and raised in Chicago, and then I did all my graduate training and everything over there before coming here for my pre-doctoral internship and my postdoctoral fellowship. And so then I kind of stayed and continued my career here in California. And yeah, so it's been an interesting journey. I think, honestly, my interest in psychology started when I was in high school, when I was
Mm-hmm.
taking AP psychology. And that was really when I decided, I was like, oh, this is like a really interesting field, and like I want to learn more about it.
Yeah, that's really neat because we also like both took AP psychology and that's also like kind of what interested us too. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's really cool.
So, what inspired you to focus on working with children, families, and communities?
Yeah, that is a great question. And so, growing up in Chicago, one of the things I've noticed is that there is a lot of disparity. So, people could be born and raised and grow up in the exact same neighborhood, but their life trajectory and their outcomes can really be so different from one another. And so that's kind of what prompted my interest in psychology too. It's because like I wanted to figure out why. Why is that the case? And I felt like as I was continuing to read and to learn, like even, all the stuff I was reading when I was in high school and then in college, so much of it seemed to stem from childhood, honestly. Um, it really seemed like, the types of things that your interactions with your parents, your interactions with your community, your schools, like your friends, all of that stuff as you're growing up during development have an impact into like who you develop into as part of your own identity, what you decide to do in your life. And I think when I was trying to figure out, what part of the lifespan am I most interested in, that really was it, because there was just so much impact from a young age. And I felt like if I wanted to then help people or to, change any part of someone else's life, like I wanted to target that earlier time span. So like early childhood, school age, adolescence, so that we can really target and help people when they're starting to like feel lost.
hmm Yeah, that's really neat. Kind of just the question is, did you maybe have any like personal experience with this that affected it, or was it kind of just like observing others?
No, definitely there's a mix of personal and professional as well. I think for me, growing up, what I had realized was that, especially in the Asian American community, and like, there is so much undiagnosed mental health issues
hmm
and things like that. And so when I was growing up, my family never talked about mental health. That just wasn't a thing for them. And so they were just like, well, you just have to, if you're sad, just go deal with it. If you're happy, great. And a lot of times it was always just like, well, what do you have to be sad about? Like, your life is so great here in the States, and et cetera, et cetera. But as I was like growing up, I realized there was so much undiagnosed anxiety and undiagnosed depression and undiagnosed like grief and, trauma that actually happened within my own family. And it took me like a long time to even realize it. Like, generational patterns of interactions of like how my grandmother interacted with my parents' generation and how my parents then interacted with me and like my sibling. It it just became so evident that it was, just there, but unsaid. And personally, I also then experienced like a lot of grief when I was in high school. So when I was in high school, like both my grandmas actually passed away within like a span of 3 months when I was a sophomore in high school. And then a couple of years later, when I was in college, like my grandpa passed away. And then one of my best friends from college passed away a couple years after that. And so it became this thing where, I tried to share some of these things with my parents, but they just never really seemed to understand. But I could tell that they were in pain too, and they were also hurting. And like sometimes, like that pain and hurt came out in like other ways. And so I think really it was a mix of all of these things that made me want to pursue this path because I think it is something that is very common for a lot of Asians where they just, either their families never talked about it, or if they did talk about it, it was more in the sense of like, you don't have to think about it. All you have to do is just like, just deal with it and then you can move on, which is not always the healthiest thing to do.
Yeah.
Yeah, what you say like really rings true. And so kind of like related to that, could you talk a little bit about your like research and what you're focusing on for our viewers?
Yeah, of course. And so my research has kind of shifted through the years. And so when I was in graduate school in Chicago, actually, even before graduate school, there were two main areas of research I was personally really interested in. One was Asian American mental health, because again, of like, my personal experiences, the experiences of my friends. And then the other thing was the amount of disparity in the city. And so growing up, like there was a lot of community violence exposure that was around in Chicago. And so things that I had personally experienced, my friends had experienced, or like people that we knew had experienced. And so then those were the two areas I wanted to pursue. So either learning more about community violence exposure and how people can, build resilience and kind of overcome some of the challenges despite that exposure, or Asian American mental health. And so when I was applying to grad school, those were kind of the research areas and mentors I was looking for. So what I ended up pursuing was I went to Loyola University Chicago, and I met up with this mentor who was phenomenal. Her name is Dr. Noni Gaylord Harden, and she did a lot of research on community violence exposure of Black youth in Chicago. So this was Black adolescents, Black kids, and families who um, were coping with the aftermath of like this violence exposure in their communities. Um, and what was really interesting is we were looking at this stuff more from a strengths-based perspective. Because as you both are going to, and your viewers, as you're going to continue to learn, a lot of times when we're thinking about people of color and minoritized populations, the literature talks about deficits. It's like, oh, there's like this wrong or this wrong and all of that stuff. And so what our lab was trying to do was look at, what are their sources of strength? What are their sources of resilience and resistance? And so we were looking at how were they actively trying to cope with this violence exposure and like, what was helpful for them. And so some of the things we found was like school belongingness. And so like that sense of community in your school can be something that's really beneficial despite, that exposure. And a lot of parental support and coping and, a lot of that community-based stuff can really help build resilience for a lot of kids who might have circumstances that are, just really challenging or not the best. And so that's the bulk of the area of my research when I was in graduate school. And then as I kind of continued on my career with like internship and postdoc, and now I'm at California State University, Long Beach, um, I still had that connection to Asian mental health. And I kind of wanted to go back into that because, I love working with Black youth, and also I want to, reconnect with like my own culture and everything too. And so some of the research I've done more recently have focused more on so continuing that line of like stress and trauma, but looking at it more from the lens of Asian American experiences. And so one of the recent studies I was doing was actually looking at or doing some focus groups with Asian Americans throughout the country and just getting an understanding of like how do they even define trauma and stress? Like what do they understand about intergenerational trauma and like how is it different from mainstream psychology? Because something that I had noticed was everything you learn about in your books, especially when we're thinking about AP psychology, is very much from that Western lens. It was like,
Yeah.
all of these great researchers and great philosophers and stuff who like created these ideas, but it was very much a singular focus. And so it didn't really think about how, Native American populations actually have their own ways of healing. Asian Americans have their own ways of healing. And so I wanted to see how kind of Asians interpreted some of these things for themselves and in their own lives. And so yeah. And then I also wanted to see like what has even been the impact of intergenerational trauma
Mhm.
within Asian American populations. And so that is something that I had been doing for a little bit, and like I had written a paper about that, and specifically, you know, um, thinking through intergenerational trauma for Asian populations, and like what are ways that they would like to heal from some of these experiences that they've had.
That's
Yeah.
really interesting. Yeah. So is there like any particular like findings you found like throughout your research that particularly interest you?
Yeah, I think something really, really interesting is something that kept coming up again and again was this idea of communication. So it really sounds like, especially when we're thinking about trauma within Asian Americans, and when we're thinking about Asian Americans, there's a lot of different types of ethnicities, right?
Yeah.
There a lot of times people think Asian, they think East Asian, but then there's also, Southeast Asian, South Asian, and different groups of people. And so I do want to mention, there is nuance there. But what has often been common is that there was a generation of silence, essentially. Like, a lot of Asian families have really long-standing like immigration stories, but many of them also have been through a lot of war. And so in our grandparents or great grandparents, or even potentially our parents' generation, some of them have been through like World War II. They've been through Cultural Revolution, the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. They've been through
Mhm.
some of the stuff that happened in like the Philippines, and and this is actually across different ethnicities. There's like kind of that history of like war and oppression that have really deeply impacted many generations and like entire generations of people. Despite that, that generation, many of them, now obviously, again, it's going to depend on family, but many of them talk about that stuff. Some of them would, and some families actually have a great historical, like oral record of history, but many families just don't. My family is one of the families that don't. And so that was something that was always really interesting, but that did come up across some of the people that I had interviewed. Is just that there was just no communication. And so their parents maybe treated them in a certain way, but there was never really a reason that they could find because they just didn't really know what their parents or grandparents had gone through. But it's because of these experiences that have impacted how each generation treats each other. So, like, for example, in my own family, my grandma's generation, she had experienced World War II as a little girl and like running away from Japanese soldiers. So, in her mind and throughout her development, survival was one of the most important things. And so she didn't have time to sit and think about mental health because she had to survive. And so that's kind of how, or like what was instilled in that next generation. And so there became a lot more anxiety and stuff in my mom's generation because that's kind of how like my grandma was treating them. Like, oh, you just have to hurry and do things. Like, just continue, just work hard and all of that stuff. But that's because of, her experiences. And so from my mom's generation, that's then how she interacted with me or my brother because that's kind of all she knew as well. And so from my mom's generation and my grandma, they kind of immigrated here to the United States around the same time. But it then became this whole other adjustment of like transitioning to becoming a citizen in this country and assimilating or like, getting used to being in American culture when there's still so much discrimination and stereotypes and different things that happen. And so because of that, she also had that like go, go, go mentality, just go to school, um, you know, to me and my brother, just go to school, just do well, don't do any extracurriculars back then. Because all you need is academics and like you'll be great. And then that was just the only mentality she knew. And that obviously like led to a lot of like perfectionism and other like anxieties and other things for me and my brother because of that. And so um that came up for a lot of other people too, but it was just the sense of like not knowing how to communicate about it because either it was never spoken about or just people never really developed the tools and skills to communicate about it because your mentality was always just like, just continue on with life. And so within the study, what I really found was one, there is this lack of communication, but two, there is this desire to communicate. Like what kept coming up was people asking, how can I talk to my parents' generation or my grandparents about this? And then how do I then communicate with like this next generation so that we don't, keep repeating the same patterns? Like in my example, it was like kind of that anxiety that was passed down and continued on and on. But like, how do we stop that from just being the cycle that never ends? And so I think that communication aspect was something that was really interesting and I kept seeing.
Yeah, that's really interesting how like each generation like affects the other and it's like a deep impact as well. And so
Mhm.
I was kind of wondering like you brought this up, but how can we or like how can youth who like feel like it's kind of hard to talk about mental health to like their parents, like how can they kind of like challenge this pattern or like make sure that this cycle doesn't like continue for future generations?
Yeah, I think it's definitely a hard thing to do because, sometimes, especially when you are an adolescent or you're in high school and you like want to talk to your parents and your parents just shut you down, like that's very unmotivating, right? But I think like it's also coming from a place of understanding, like trying to learn about, your own history, maybe through books initially, and then kind of bringing it up with them and seeing like if they're willing to talk about the impact of it and then telling them like I understand that might be hard for you to talk about or that you don't want to think about this and I want to share that this all of these things I feel like has impacted me in XYZ way. And so that you just want to be able to share your emotions, your feelings, or whatever it is. Um, and slowly, hopefully, they would be open to like talking more about this. But it's going to be something that takes time. It's not going to be something that's going to be like a one-time thing and then, magically like kids and parents are talking to each other. But it's like slowly trying to, open that book that's been like shut super tight.
Yeah. I think like breaking like generational like cycles definitely takes like a lot of time and like effort. So moving on to like your research a little bit. So could you maybe explain what strength perspective is and like why it's important to study trauma and resilience?
Yeah. So I think when we're thinking about working with kids, what a lot of the research has found, and I don't know how much you were reading about like adverse childhood experiences and all of that in your high school studies, but when we think about the early impact of trauma, it can actually have really long-lasting effects. And so if a child is really neglected or abused or something when they were like really young, that can actually have a lot of impact on their adult outcomes. Like some people say like, oh, they're just kids, like they're not going to remember it, but the body does remember. And there's actually a book called The Body Keeps Its Score, The Body Keeps the Score or something like that. Because the body has these like somatic responses and different things that kind of like um, that do deeply impact that long development because like your cells change, your brain changes and different things when that early trauma happens. And so because of that, it is helpful for us to think about things from that trauma-informed perspective because if a child is acting out, there typically is a reason for that. I know there are some parents who get so frustrated, or like even teachers, they're so frustrated, they're like, oh, this kid might just be a bad kid. But if we dig a little deeper and we find out, no, this child was actually like, severely neglected or abused when they were younger, um, that is the reason why they're having these behavioral issues. And it's not just because they're like a quote unquote bad kid. And because of that, your perspective changes, right? As a parent or as well, not so much a parent, maybe like a foster parent, but as a foster parent or like a teacher, and so rather than just blaming the child, you're going to be shifting the perspective from what is wrong with this child to what happened to this child. And when we're thinking about what happened to this child, we can then be a little bit more empathetic and think of different ways to actually interact with them, so that we can kind of help them along on their healing process. And so personally, that's kind of why I feel like, researching that trauma and resilience is so important because sometimes we needlessly blame people for things that they truly had no control over when they were much younger. So with a strengths-based, or actually, okay, great. With the strengths-based perspective, I think what is really important about that is the fact that going tying back to my previous point, when we only look at what's wrong with someone, it's only going to get us so far because that's not necessarily going to tell us ways to actually help this person. Um, the other thing that is really important too is every individual already has a lot of skills and assets that they can potentially use to kind of improve on their mental health, improve on their life, or whatever. And so I think like it is much more empowering to people if we are able to kind of help them to find, what are the aspects that motivate them? What are the different things that really drive them to be able to achieve whatever goals and values that they have? And like, thinking through what do they already have in order to continue along the path to help them to succeed in whatever way that they want, rather than constantly telling someone like, you can't do this, you can't do that. All of that is really unmotivating and it's not necessarily going to be helpful. But if we're able to kind of shift that perspective, to be able to help people think about, what are the positive assets that they might have, to be able to work on their mental health in like a positive way, then that's going to be a little bit more beneficial. Now, the one caveat to that I do want to say is I'm not talking about toxic positivity either, because that's not necessarily going to be helpful. We we're not going to just tell everyone everything's going to be a-okay, everything's going to be
Yeah.
perfect, because that's not realistic. But we do want to think about, what are the things that they can actively do to be able to help themselves.
Yeah, I think that was really well said. So, kind of like pivoting back to your research, what are some of like the biggest gaps you see in your research regarding like underrepresented youth?
Oh, so much. There's so many gaps. I think a really big one is the fact that if we're thinking about Asians are all kind of lumped together in a majority of research. And as I said, like there's vastly different experiences that people have experienced in these different ethnicities. And so I think if we're really thinking about the impact of, intergenerational trauma or other things, like we have to be able to disaggregate the data to a certain degree. So like, you know, thinking through about how does one thing impact like Chinese Americans versus impacting like Vietnamese Americans versus like Filipino Americans or whatever it might be, so that we can get a better sense of like, what are some of the cultural differences that are present because we're not all the same. Like there are nuances to like these different cultures. And the other thing too is that there is very limited research funding that has been given out for doing Asian American research.
Mhm.
And so because of that, there really aren't that many researchers out there. It's increased in recent years for sure, but there aren't like that many people who are doing this work. And so even so going back earlier when I was explaining how kind of I went down the path of community violence exposure is I just couldn't really find too many mentors who were doing Asian American specific mental health research.
Oh.
There are a couple out there, but and as I said, more now. But when I was applying, it was just a challenge to kind of find that. And so I think luckily more Asians are interested in mental health now, and so I feel like it's a growing area, but it's still a gap for sure.
Yeah, so like how do you think that like our schools and communities can like better help these youth that are exposed to trauma and violence?
I think we have to build community. Um, Something that, as I kind of mentioned earlier, even like some of the factors that seem to really be protective for kids are community based. So it's like, what type of parental support, but also what type of like other family support, school belongingness, what do they like see other people? When someone has a sense of community, it can really help fight against some of the negative impacts of trauma that people might have experienced. And I think that is something that continues to be a challenge for a lot of people. And especially a couple years ago with like the COVID pandemic and like people were like, sheltering at home and stuff, a lot of community was lost. And so now it's like also a sense of like continuing to rebuild that. And for a lot of Asian immigrants, like it's hard to find community as well, depending on, where in the country you might live. Like you may or may not find people who are like you. And so I think that is a really important aspect that we need to continue to build. And so, stuff like your podcast where you're actually trying to connect people, trying to help people learn. And like, I think all of that stuff is really great.
Okay, yeah, definitely. And so this is kind of like more about you, but how do you maybe deal with like the emotional weight of studying like trauma and violence? Because it can be like heavy topic.
Yeah, for sure. And I think going back to my point I just said about support, like it is really important to not do this alone because I think
Mm.
whenever you're doing anything, when you feel alone, it just gets so challenging. But when you feel like you're able to share this with other people, like to kind of lighten your load, it can help so much. I think something else that was really recommended for a lot of people who study this field is to also have your own therapist and your own therapy to be able to kind of separate, your professional life and your personal life. Because yeah, it can get really challenging. Because not only, many people in this field, especially for psychologists, they are doing this research, but they might also have their own clinical practice. And so, if they're also seeing clients who have been through significant trauma, that can be really challenging to just be surrounded by it all the time. And so, it's also a healthy separation of like, what is your professional life versus your personal life as well.
Yeah,
Yeah,
definitely.
like
So
having that work-life balance.
yeah.
Mhm.
So how do you hope that your research and clinical work will eventually impact the community and future generations?
Yeah, I love that question. And I think like it's really building that knowledge. For so many Asians, especially, like representation is something that we still struggle to have. So, like, it's gotten better. There's more people who might look like us on TV or different things like that. But I think like people need to be able to read stories in their textbook that are about people like them. And so I think it is important for us to be able to like continue to do that research so people understand like there is not a single way to live, and there's not a single theory that's gonna, you know, explain everything for every single person. And so we need to be able to explore like, what are different models of identity, different models of resilience, and like how that can help people of like different cultures and different backgrounds. And I think having people understand that they're not alone when it comes to a lot of the challenging experiences that they might be experiencing. So, stress and trauma is unfortunately like it's not like a super common experience, but it is something that happens. And so I think like making sure that people feel like that they have a sense of some degree of normalcy within that, so that they can then find the strength for like healing and all of that.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's definitely really inspiring. So I kind of just had like a question about like your experience. If you've worked with like these underrepresented like youth or families where there maybe might be like a stigma around mental health. Do you have like maybe a particular story that really impacted you?
That is a good question. I think in terms of the people that I've worked with, it has really varied because I think there have definitely been families. So um, in terms of stigma, there's like, that's multi-layered. But I do remember there was one family I was working with, or actually multiple families, where and this moves away from like the whole topic of stress and trauma. But
Mhm.
so as I mentioned, in my work, I've done a lot of research, but I've also done some clinical work where I actively was working with like children and families. And so one diagnosis that does continue to have a lot of stigma, especially among underrepresented families, is autism spectrum disorder. And so there are a lot of families who would really just not like to admit that their child might have autism, or if their child does have autism, they kind of say like, oh, well, it's just their issue, like it doesn't have anything to do with us. Whereas when I'm working with a child, like, yes, I might be doing therapy with a child one-on-one, but it still takes a lot of participation from the parent because the parent is then going to be interacting with this kid for the rest of the week.
Yeah.
I see someone like one-on-one an hour a week. The rest of the week is with the parent. But there was one situation where I was working with an Asian family, and um, it was a child with autism with significant behavioral issues, but this parent was just kind of like, just fix my child, but they didn't really want to do much work on themselves because I wanted to do a little bit more parent work to like strengthen the parent-child bond, but there was just I think some hesitation there, and it was definitely a challenge to be able to kind of um, to work on that. But again, it was something that took a lot of time, so that I was able to kind of explain why that parent-child relationship was so important. And I think what was also helpful too is just comparing that diagnosis to anything else. Like this diagnosis is not so far different from any other type of person because neurodivergence is kind of like on a spectrum. And so, yeah, it was something that just took a lot of time and a lot of conversation for the parent to kind of come around to be able to work on this together, and really focusing on, we're just wanting the best for their child. And so yeah, I think that's the story that comes to mind when you ask that question.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, the work that you do is definitely really important.
Yeah. Okay,
And
so
so that was like our last question
mhm.
for like this interview. And so we loved all like your answers, and I think that you're really eloquent in like the way you talk. And so thank you so much for like again taking like the time to be on our
No podcast.
podcast.
Yeah.